Hey everybody. This is a section. I guess I should call it section. It's section 2 of Aufheben's. What was the USSR? What was the USSR? Towards a theory of the deformation of value under state capitalism. I'm reading from the book format that was released by ThoughtCrimeInc.com, printed by Black Cat Press in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, www.blackcatpress.ca. I don't know if that website is still in existence, but this publishing project put out some really neat stuff. So check it out. So here we go. The section's titled, The Theory of the USSR as a Form of State Capitalism Within Trotskyism. First section, Introduction. For Trotsky, the Stalinist system in the USSR could only be but a transitory historical phenomena. Lacking a firm legal basis in the ownership of the means of production, the Stalinist bureaucracy was doomed to a mere fleeting appearance in the overall course of history. Indeed, throughout the 1930s, Trotsky had been convinced that the days of the Stalinist bureaucracy were numbered. For Trotsky, world capitalism was in a terminal decline. The economic stagnation that had followed the Wall Street crash in 1929 could only intensify imperialist rivalries amongst the great capitalist powers, which ultimately could only be resolved through the devastation of a Second World War. Yet Trotsky firmly believed that, like the First World War, this Second World War would bring in its wake a renewed revolutionary wave that would sweep the whole of Europe, if not the world. In the midst of such a revolutionary wave, the Russian working class would be in a position to overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy in a political revolution which would then, with the aid of revolutions elsewhere, open the way for Russia to complete its transition to socialism. Even if the worst came to the worst, and the post-war revolutionary wave was defeated, then the way would be open for the restoration of capitalism in Russia. With the defeat of the proletariat, both in Russia and elsewhere, the Stalinist bureaucracy would soon take the opportunity to convert itself into a new bourgeoisie through the privatization of state industry. Either way, the Stalinist bureaucracy would soon disappear, along with the entire Stalinist system that had arisen from the degeneration of the Russian Revolution. As the approach of the Second World War became more and more apparent, Trotsky became more convinced that Stalin's day of reckoning would not be far off. Yet not all of Trotsky's followers shared his optimism. Following his expulsion from Russia in 1929, Trotsky had sought to re-establish the left opposition on an international basis, seeking to oppose Stalin with the Third International of Communist Parties. Seeking to oppose Stalin within the Third International of Communist Parties. However, in the face of Stalin's resolute hold over the Third International and the Third International's constituent communist parties, Trotsky's effort to build the international left opposition within the official world communist movement soon proved to be futile. In 1933, Trotsky decided to break from the Third International and attempted to regroup all those communists opposed to Stalin in an effort to build a new Fourth International. With the international upturn in the class struggle of the mid-1930s, which culminated in the Spanish Revolution in 1936, increasing numbers of communists who had become disillusioned with Stalinism were drawn to Trotsky's project. By 1938, Trotsky had felt that the time had come to establish the Fourth International. Although the various groups across the world who supported the project of a Fourth International were still very small compared with the mass communist parties of the Third International, Trotsky believed that it was vital to have the international organization of the Fourth International in place before the onset of the Second World War. Trotsky believed that just as the First World War had thrown the international workers' movement into confusion, with all the socialist parties of the Second International being swept along in patriotic fervor, so the same would happen with the onset of the Second World War. In such circumstances, the Fourth International would have to provide a resolute point of reference and clarity in the coming storm, which would then provide a rallying point once the patriotic fever had given way to the urge for revolution amongst the working class across the world. By 1938, the upturn in class struggle had more or less passed. The Spanish Revolution had been defeated and Franco's fascists were well on their way to winning the Spanish Civil War. With fascism already triumphant in Italy and Germany and advancing elsewhere in Europe, the situation was looking increasingly bleak for those on the left that had become disillusioned with Stalinism. Furthermore, few could have been as convinced as Trotsky was that the onset of the Second World War, which promised to be even more terrible than the first, would bring in its wake a renewed revolutionary situation in Europe, if not the world. As a consequence, many even within the Fourth International came to draw rather pessimistic conclusions concerning the world situation. Within such a pessimistic perspective, it was easy to conclude that the socialist revolution had failed both in Russia and the rest of Europe in the early 1920s. From this, it was but a short step to argue that capitalism was not being replaced by socialism, as Marx had foreseen, but by a new and unforeseen form of society in which all political and economic life was subsumed by a totalitarian state, which had become evident not only in Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, but also in Stalin's Russia. The new form of society now seemed destined to dominate the world, and as capitalism had done before it. This view found its expression in the various theories of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, that increasingly gained support amongst Trotskyists towards the end of the 1930s. The theory of bureaucratic collectivism was originally put forward by Bruno Rizzi in the early 1930s. It was in 1939 that this theory became central to the first grave crisis in Trotskyism. As we have seen on the basis of his theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state, Trotsky had argued that, despite all the crimes it says perpetuated, but I think perpetrated is the right word. Maybe I'm wrong. I'll say what it said in the text. I'll say perpetuated. As we have seen, on the basis of his theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state, Trotsky had argued that, despite all the crimes perpetuated by Stalin's regime, it was necessary, in order to defend the proletarian gains of the Russian Revolution, to give critical support to the Soviet Union. As we have also noted, this position became increasingly difficult to defend as the true nature of Stalin's regime became apparent, particularly after the Moscow show trials of the 1930s and the role of the Stalinists in crushing the workers' revolution in Spain in the May days of 1937. For many Trotskyists, the last straw came when Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in August 1939. Here was the USSR openly dealing with a fascist regime. In September 1939, several leading members of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States, which, with several thousand members, was one of the largest sections of the Fourth International, announced the formation of an organized minority faction opposed to the official stance toward the USSR. Now, this is a tricky question because these minorities were not necessarily united in their conception of the USSR, right? So there was, like, say, you might say the left, or I would say that they were the left of the opposition, which was the left of, I would say, is the left of the majority in the Socialist Workers' Party. There was Joseph Carter and James Burnham, who straight up said it was, the USSR was a bureaucratic collectivist society that can no longer be categorized as a worker state. The middle that were kind of had their doubts, which would be like Max Shachtman, and then other people. I think it was Glotzer. It might not be Glotzer though, but another like tendency within the minority still believed that the USSR is a degenerated worker state. And it's hard to disentangle one's conception of the USSR from one's like political attitudes towards if you're within the Trotskyist tradition and within the Marxist tradition. But what was most then a concern is whether they should uphold the principle of unconditional defense of the USSR, come what may. Was they viewed that there was that the USSR had become not just like a full cooperator in world imperialism, as manifested in primarily, not exclusively, but in the period of these debates, especially with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and the more or less agreed to carving up of Poland and Baltic states such as Finland. That was what the crux of the debate was about, because the minority was not united, particularly around Burnham's position. Um, um, it was more about whether unconditional defense should be the political slogan of the Fourth International. Anyway. In this minority's polemics, this is back to the text, with Trotsky and his supporters in the Americas, the Socialist Workers' Party notion central to bureaucratic collectivism. In their polemics with Trotsky and his supporters in the American Socialist Workers' Party, the notion central to bureaucratic collectivism, that Stalin's Russia was little different from that of Hitler's Germany, proved to be a powerful weapon. I would not say that that's a core of bureaucratic collectivism. That might be the opinion of Bruno Rizzi, for instance, and maybe certain people like, for instance, Dwight MacDonald. He kind of was in the orbit of this minority, but yeah, I don't think they didn't have the idea that Hitler's Germany was a bureaucratic collectivist state. Some did, but it wasn't a rule. Indeed, many of the leading figures in this oppositional faction, which eventually split from the Socialist Workers' Party in 1940 to form the Workers' Party, came to adopt the theory of bureaucratic collectivism as their own. As such, the theory of bureaucratic collectivism came to pose the main challenge to orthodox Trotskyism from within Trotskyism itself. In his interventions in the fierce polemics that preceded the split in the American Socialist Workers' Party, Trotsky made it clear that he saw the theory of bureaucratic collectivism as nothing less than a direct attack not merely on his own ideas, but on Marxism itself. The notion that the capitalist mode of production was destined to be surpassed, not by socialism, but by a form of society based on bureaucratic collectivism, clearly broke with the fundamental understanding of history that had underpinned Marxism from its very inception. Another point of clarification here, from my perspective, giving my 2 cents, which you have to hear my marginalia. The Workers' Party did not have the understanding that the capitalist mode of production was destined to be surpassed by bureaucratic collectivism. They did not share the same kind of harsh teleological, I would argue dogmatic notions of Trotsky that must be the case, right? For them, this was something that was happening, that had happened in Russia. Some viewed it more of as a global tendency towards bureaucratic collectivism, but they were still believed that socialism was on the immediate horizon. They did not abandon the idea that socialism was the next stage. I would argue that they had a more open Marxism associated with a particular tendency, or a particular school of high-level theory, but they definitely had more of an open conception of historical processes, right, than, say, like Orthodox Marxists had in either Third International or Second International form. They had the idea that, which I think is correct, that the end of capitalism might not necessarily usher in socialism. There's a piece by Marcel Stutzler that I keep meaning to read that is titled that, on the possibility of the end of capitalism not bringing communism, but I haven't read it yet. But I think that would be a very good piece to read in conjunction with the bureaucratic collectivist theorists. Even though they're coming from radically two different things, right? Marcel Stutzler comes from like the Frankfurt School world, and the third camp Trotskyists come from the Trotskyist Leninist world. Anyway. In his interventions in the fierce polemics that preceded the split in the American Socialist Workers' Party, Trotsky made it clear that he saw the theory of bureaucratic collectivism as nothing less than a direct attack, not merely on his own ideas, but on Marxism itself. The notion that the capitalist mode of production was destined to be surpassed, not by socialism, but by a form of society based on bureaucratic collectivism, clearly broke with the fundamental understanding of history that underpinned Marxism from its very inception. Yet, if this was not bad enough, none of the various versions of the theory of bureaucratic collectivism went as far as to provide an adequate materialist and class analysis of what bureaucratic collectivism was and how it had come about. As a result, as Trotsky ceaselessly pointed out, these theories of bureaucratic collectivism were unable to go beyond the level of appearance, and as such remained merely descriptive. To my understanding, at least, the bureaucratic collectivist people had the theory that, not that Trotsky's like empirical analysis or is like more like detailed, like concrete analysis of developments within the Soviet Union were wrong, but that the theoretical conclusions that he drew from these this more like empirical detail was off base, right? They felt like that Trotsky's own arguments lent themselves to their conclusions. Not that Trotsky's like research or concrete explanations of dynamics within the USSR was wrong. I think is a degree to which it is true that the theory of bureaucratic collectivism is somewhat, people say this all the time, and I think there's some truth in it, but there's developments within this tendency that take it a little further. But there is a degree to which bureaucratic collectivism is like a little negative, right? Its like main thesis, I would argue, is that in the Stalinist period, Stalin created an exploitative, not Stalin, but like not necessarily Stalin himself, but what came to develop was a society that was neither socialist nor capitalist, but still exploitative. They, as opposed to, especially the state capitalist people, they did not, at least I don't know of like major tracks. They didn't try to establish what like the internal workings of that society were like in any like extended detail. Of course, the two major thinkers who were associated with kind of like bringing bureaucratic collectivist thesis, like historians that are more like close to like Draper say like E. Haberkern say that like there was no relationship between the Ricci thesis and the thesis of the minority opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party. But the two main theorists of bureaucratic collectivism that like initiated it in the American Trotskyist scene were James Burnham and Joseph Carter. And Joseph Carter, I think, I'm not sure when, but some point in the 1940s, kind of just like drifted out of political life altogether. And James Burnham obviously left the Workers' Party almost as soon as it was founded and declared that Marxism was a bunch of mumbo-jumbo and phooey, and wrote his book, The Managerial Revolution, which I'm not in a position to say the consistencies or differences between Burnham's work within the Socialist Workers' Party on bureaucratic collectivism and his work in the Managerial Revolution. I'm not in a position to say what the differences are, but it is important to note that the people who initially put forward the thesis kind of fell away from the movement. Joseph Carter, I think, just kind of was just like done with politics, and I think I've kind of gotten the impression that like he didn't have like the powerful, he didn't like quite have like the strong commanding personality of like other people within the minority. Like he wasn't Shachtman or Burnham. His like he didn't seem like the kind of guy who would like voluntarily kind of like stand up and be like, I'm gonna like, it seemed like he didn't have like the will necessarily to make his thesis generalized, if that makes sense, right? And we all know this, so you could say like people like this. I think the reason why I'm imagining this is get this feeling, because I feel like I know the people like this, people who are like kind of like brilliant and brilliantly critical, but don't necessarily have particularly like the abrasive argumentative qualities that would make them good for public debate, which is what would be necessary within this milieu to make your policy or your political view, your particular views common. You have to get up on the fucking podium and you have to say, okay, this is why Trotsky and James P. Cannon and the majority are wrong in their analysis of the USSR. I don't think he was that kind of dude, Joseph Carter. It would be interesting. I think there definitely should be, if you're looking for something to write about, it would definitely be interesting to develop some kind of biography, however brief, of Joseph Carter. But anyway, back to the text. Such criticisms were seen to be borne out by the eventual fate of the various theories of bureaucratic collectivism and their leading proponents. Having abandoned Marxism, the theories of bureaucratic collectivism lacked any theoretical grounding of their own. As a consequence, they were obliged to look to various strands of bourgeois sociology, and ended up joining the growing stream of bourgeois theorists that saw the increasing totalitarianism and bureaucratization of modern societies as an inevitable result of the complexities of industrial society. This is perhaps best illustrated by one of the leading figures in the split from the American Socialist Workers' Party in 1940, James Burnham. As a university professor, Burnham was recognized as one of the leading intellectuals in the minority that split from the American Socialist Workers' Party, but he went on to become one of the originators of the theory of the, quote, managerial society, end quote, which has become popular amongst bourgeois sociologists in the 1950s and 60s. Yet, while the logic of bureaucratic collectivism led Burnham to become a liberal, for Shachtman, who had been one of the prime proponents of the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, it meant eventually ending up as a virulent anti-communist who openly backed the McCarthy witch hunts of the 1950s. That's incorrect, and Max Shachtman has spelled it wrong here. Max Shachtman did not become a virulent anti-communist in the 1950s. Shachtman's rightward turn towards more of a Cold War socialist or like Cold War Fabian of different kinds was not readily apparent until the late 1950s and early 1960s, primarily with his kind of non-critique of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was not a virulent anti-communist in the 1950s, and he did not back McCarthy. For those who remained loyal to Trotsky, the fate of these supporters of the bureaucratic collectivism could only be taken as a stern lesson in the dangers of straying too far from the teachings of Trotsky and Marxist orthodoxy. Yet it should be noted here that not all those who split from the American Socialist Workers' Party at this time were proponents of a theory of bureaucratic collectivism or variants of one. From the very foundation of the Fourth International, there had been a significant minority with the Trotskyist movement, who had opposed Trotsky's stance to the USSR by arguing that Russia was not a degenerated worker state, but was simply state capitalist. It was this theory of the USSR as being state capitalist, which was to reemerge with greater force after the Second World War, as we shall now see. If he's talking about if he's talking about the early people who would have a state capitalist thesis within the Trotskyist movement, the first one would be Ryan L. Worrall, who I think was a Trotskyist, but kind of like on the fringes of it to a certain extent. I think he was like a philosophy professor or something like that. But he, like I said, like a lot of the way that these ideas gain traction is through like the political movements that they're associated with, right? Like Trotsky's thesis is as popular and like dominant as it was, not just to its merits, which I would say that there is like a significant merits, at least in the revolution portrayed. I think offers a lot of brilliant insight and provides a lot of information, a lot of things to think about. But the reason he's popular is because he's fucking Leon Trotsky. He's like an important historical figure who had a whole fucking movement behind him after, the rise of Stalinism. But this guy, Ryan L. Worrall, for instance, I don't think his ideas about state capitalism had too much particular traction outside of a very small group of people. The first people that I'm aware of that were really putting forward the state capitalist thesis within the Trotskyist movement would have been first and foremost C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya. Tony Cliff, I do not believe, develops his state capitalist theory until later. I have a piece up here, the biography by Ian Birchall of Tony Cliff, talking about the development of his state capitalist thesis over time. And I don't believe that he comes to that point until late in the 1940s, well after Trotsky's death in August 1940. So this is not contemporary with Trotsky, and it would have been 10 years after his death. But it would have been... And the Fourth International would have been founded in 1938. They're trying to say this kind of state capitalist thesis started with the very foundation of the Fourth International in 1938. I would be very, very, I think that's very, very doubtful that there was a state capitalist moment within the Fourth International at that time. But yeah.
New section.
The theory of state capitalism and the second crisis in Trotskyism. Trotsky's predictions for the end of the Second World War, which had sustained the hopes of those who had remained loyal to Trotsky, were soon proved to be false. There was no repeat of the great revolutionary wave that had swept Europe at the end of the First World War, nor was the grip of either Stalinism or social democracy on the workers' movements weakened. On the contrary, both Stalinism and social democracy emerged from the Second World War far stronger than they had ever been. As it became increasingly apparent that the realities of the immediate post-war world contradicted the predictions that Trotsky had made before his death in 1940, and with them the basic orientation of the Fourth International, the strains within the Trotskyist movement between those who sought to revise Trotskyism to meet these new realities and those who feared such revisionism reached the point of crisis. In 1953, less than 8 years after the end of the war, the Fourth International finally split, giving rise to the, quote, 57 varieties, end quote, of Trotskyism that we find today. One of the crucial issues at the heart of this crisis within Trotskyism was that of the question of the respective natures of the USSR and Eastern Europe. The retreat of the German armies during the final stages of the war had prompted popular uprisings across Eastern Europe. For the most part, these uprisings had either been constrained by the Stalinists, where they provided the popular base on which to build broad-based anti-fascist governments, or, to the extent that they could not be contained, they were either crushed by the advancing Red Army, or else abandoned to the vengeance of the retreating German forces. At first, Stalin did not seek to impose the economic or political model of the Soviet Union on the countries of Eastern Europe. The broad-based anti-fascist governments were elected on traditional bourgeois democratic lines and in most cases came to include not only communists and socialists but also liberals and representatives of the peasants and rural classes. Although these governments were encouraged to carry out nationalizations of key industries and implement various social and agrarian reforms, in many respects this differed little from the policies of nationalization of ailing industry and welfare reforms that were happening elsewhere in Europe. But as the Cold War began to set in and Europe began to polarize between East and West, Stalin began to impose the Soviet economic and political model onto Eastern Europe, if necessary, the post-war coalitions were pushed aside and the wholesale nationalization of industry was carried out and the market was replaced by centralized planning. The initial phase of the post-war era in Eastern Europe had presented Trotskyists with few problems. The uprisings at the end of the war could be seen as portents of the coming world revolution, while the repression of the Stalinists could be righteously condemned. Furthermore, the fact that these uprisings had for the most part failed explained why Eastern Europe remained capitalist. However, once the, quote, Russification of Eastern Europe, end quote, began to take place, Trotskyist theory began to face a serious dilemma. Of course, the transformation of property relations that had been brought about by the wholesale nationalization of industry and the introduction of centralized planning could be seen to reaffirm Trotsky's insistence on the objectively progressive role of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Indeed, it could now be argued that the Stalinist bureaucracy had not only defended the proletarian gains of the Russian Revolution, but had now extended them to the rest of Eastern Europe. Yet, if this was the case, did this not imply that the countries of Eastern Europe had now become degenerated worker states like the USSR? But how could you have a degenerated worker state when there had been no revolution and thus no worker state in the first place? Exclamation point. It was now no longer just that a worker state was supposed to exist where the workers had no state power, as Trotsky had argued for Stalinist Russia, but worker states were now supposed to exist where the working class had never been in power. With the question of Eastern Europe and the fundamental dichotomy of Trotsky's theory of a degenerated worker state, in which the objective interests of the working class are somehow able to stand apart from and against the working class in the form of the alien power of the bureaucracy, now stood exposed. But if the countries of Eastern Europe were not admitted as being degenerated worker states, then what were they? The obvious answer, given that the principal means of production had been simply nationalized by the state without a workers' revolution, was that they were state capitalist. However, such an answer contained even greater dangers for orthodox Trotskyists than the first. As Eastern Europe became reconstructed in the image of the USSR, it became increasingly difficult to avoid the conclusion that if the countries of Eastern Europe were state capitalist, then so must the Soviet Union be nothing other than a form of state capitalism. After numerous attempts to resolve this dilemma, the official line which emerged within the leadership of the Fourth International was that the uprising at the end of the war had all been part of a proletarian revolution that had been mutilated and deformed by Stalinism. The countries of Eastern Europe were therefore not degenerated worker states as such, but, quote, deformed worker states, end quote. Yet this attempted solution still implied that the Stalinist bureaucracy was an active agent in creating the objective conditions of socialism. As we have seen, Trotsky had argued that the Stalinist bureaucracy was progressive in that, in defending its own basis in state property, it was impelled to defend the objective gains of the proletarian revolution, that is, the state ownership of the means of production. Now Trotskyism had come to argue that the Stalinist bureaucracy not only defended such proletarian gains, but could now actually extend them! Exclamation point. While the Stalinist bureaucracy now deemed to be a primary agent in the transition to socialism, the importance of the revolutionary role of the working class became diminished. The way was now open for Trotskyists in the coming decades to support all sorts of nationalist movements regardless of the role within them of the proletariat. New section. Cliff and the Neo-Trotskyist theory of the USSR as state capitalist. Perhaps rather ironically, Tony Cliff was originally sent to Britain by the leadership of the Fourth International in an effort to head off any potential support within the British section for the theory that Eastern Europe and the USSR were in any way state capitalist. As it turned out, it was not Jerry Healy, Ted Grant, or any of the other leading figures of the British Revolutionary Communist Party at that time who came to adopt the theory of state capitalism, but none other than Cliff himself. Yet in coming to the viewpoint that it was not Eastern Europe that was state capitalist, but also the USSR, Tony Cliff was determined not to follow in the footsteps of so many former Trotskyists who, having rejected Trotsky's theory of Russia as a degenerated worker state, had come to reject Trotsky and even Marxism itself. Instead, Cliff was committed to developing a state capitalist theory of the USSR which remained firmly within both the Trotskyist and Orthodox Marxist tradition. Against those who argued that the theory of the USSR was as a degenerated worker state was central to Trotsky's Marxism, Cliff replied by arguing that not only were there numerous examples in Trotsky's own writings where he indicated serious doubts concerning his conclusion that the USSR was a degenerated worker state, but that towards the end of his life Trotsky had shown signs of moving away from such conclusions altogether. Indeed, Cliff sought to claim that had Trotsky lived, then he too would have eventually come around to the conclusion that the USSR had become state capitalist, and certainly would not have dogmatically defended a position that flew in the face of all the evidence, as his loyal followers in the leadership of the Fourth International had done. Cliff originally presented his rather heretical ideas in 1948 in the form of a duplicated discussion document entitled The Nature of Stalinist Russia. After several editions and accompanying amendments and additions, the text now takes the form of a book titled State Capitalism in Russia, which provides us with a definitive statement of Cliff's position. Cliff devoted much of the first third of State Capitalism in Russia to presenting a mass of evidence with which he sought to show both the exploitative and repressive nature of the USSR. Yet as powerful an indictment of the Stalinist regime as this may have been, the evidence Cliff presented was far from sufficient to convince his opponents within either the Revolutionary Communist Party or the broader Fourth International. For Orthodox Trotskyists, such evidence could simply be taken to confirm the extent of the degeneration of the Soviet Union, and did little to refute the persistence of Russia as essentially a worker state. As Cliff himself recognized, it was necessary to demonstrate that the apparent exploitative and repressive character of the Soviet Union necessarily arose, not from the degeneration of the Soviet Union as a worker state, but rather from the fact that under Stalin the USSR had ceased to be a worker state and had become state capitalist. Yet to do this, Cliff had first to clarify what he meant by, quote, state capitalism, and how such a conception was not only compatible with, but rooted within the orthodox Marxist tradition. For orthodox Marxism, capitalism had been defined as a class society dominated by generalized commodity exchange which arises from the private ownership of the means of production. On the basis of such a definition, it would appear at least sight that the notion of state capitalism in the absolute sense was a contradiction in terms. If all the means of production are nationalized, the capitalist class expropriated, and the law of value in the market replaced by state allocation and planning, then it would appear that capitalism must have been, by definition, abolished. If it was accepted that, for the most part, the Russian Revolution had led to the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production, then it would seem clear that, from a Marxist point of view, capitalism in any form could not exist in the USSR. And of course, this is the common objection we find advanced against all theories of state capitalism in the USSR. However, as Cliff was keen to point out, it had also been central to orthodox Marxism that the capitalist mode of production was transitory. Capitalism was merely a phase in human history whose very development would eventually undermine its own basis. As capitalism repeatedly revolutionized methods of production, it advanced the forces of production to an unprecedented degree. Yet in advancing the forces of production, capitalism was obliged to increasingly socialize production. As production was carried out on an ever larger and more complex scale, the more social the productive production process became, the more it came into conflict with the private appropriation of the wealth that it produced. As a result, capitalism was obliged to negate its very own basis in the private ownership of production, and in doing so, it prepared the way for socialism. One second. As we have noted before, already by the end of the 19th century, most Marxists had come to the view that the classical stage of free competitive capitalism that had been described and analyzed by Marx in the 1860s had given way to the final stages of the capitalist era. The growth of huge cartels and monopolies and the increasing economic role of the state was seen as negating the market and the operation of the law of value. At the same time, the emergence of joint stock companies and the nationalization of key industries meant the replacement of individual capitalist ownership of the means of production by collective forms of ownership which implied the further negation of private property. Indeed, as Engels argued, the development of both monopoly and state capitalism was leading to the point that the capitalist class was superfluous in the production process itself. Capital no longer needed the capitalist, as Engels himself states, quote, The conversion of the great organizations for production and communication into joint stock companies and state properties show that for this purpose the bourgeoisie can be dispensed with. All the social functions of the capitalist are now carried out by salaried employees. The capitalist is no longer any social activity save the pocketing of revenues, the clipping of coupons, and gambling on the stock exchange, where different capitalists fleece each other of their capital. Just as at first the capitalist mode of production displaced the workers, so now the capitalist mode of production displaces the capitalists, relegating the capitalists, just as the capitalist mode of production did the workers, to the superfluous population, even if in the first instance not to the industrial reserve army. But neither the conversion into joint stock companies nor into state property deprives the productive forces of their character as capital. In the case of joint stock companies, this is obvious, and the modern state too is only the organization which bourgeois society provides itself in order to maintain the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against encroachments either by workers or by individual capitalists. The modern state, whatever the modern state's form, is an essentially capitalist machine. The modern state is the state of capitalists, the ideal collective body of all capitalists. The more productive forces the modern state takes over, as the modern state's property, the more the modern state becomes the real collective body of all capitalists. The more citizens the modern state exploits. The workers remain wage earners, proletarians. The capitalist relationship is not abolished. The capitalist relationship is rather pushed to an extreme. But at this extreme, the capitalist relationship is transformed into the capitalist relationship's opposite. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but state ownership of the means of the productive forces contains within itself the formal means, the key to the solution." End quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. So for the old orthodoxy of the Second International, it was undoubtedly accepted that there was an inherent tendency towards state capitalism. Indeed, it was this tendency which was seen as laying the basis for socialism. Yet it had also been central for both Lenin and the New Bolshevik orthodoxy. Not only did the increasing negation of private property and the law of value indicate the ripeness for socialism, but the fusion of the state and capital within state capitalism explained the increasing imperialist rivalries that had led to the First World War. As the competitive struggle between capital and capital became at the same time a struggle between imperialist states, imperialist war became inevitable. As Bukharin remarks in Imperialism and the World Economy, which provided a theoretical basis for Lenin's theory of imperialism, quote, when competition has finally reached its highest stage, when competition has finally reached competition's highest stage, when competition has become competition between state capitalist trusts, then the use of state power and the possibilities connected with it play a very large part. The state apparatus has always served as a tool in the hands of the ruling classes of the state's country. The state apparatus's country. And the state apparatus has always acted as the ruling class's, quote, defender and protector, end quote, in the world market. At no time, however, did it have the colossal importance that it has in the epoch of finance capital and imperialist politics. With the formation of state capitalist trusts, competition is being almost entirely shifted onto foreign countries. Obviously, the organs of the struggle that is to be waged abroad, primarily state power, must therefore grow tremendously, ... If state power is generally growing in significance, the growth of state power's military organization, the Army and the Navy, is particularly striking. The struggle between state capitalist trusts is decided in the first place by the relation between their military forces. For military power of the country is the last resort of the struggling, quote, national, end quote, groups of capitalists, end quote, Bukharin. So it could not be doubted that the notion that capitalism was developing towards state capitalism, such that its very basis within both the law of value and private property was increasingly becoming negated, was clearly rooted within orthodox Marxism. The question then was whether state capitalism in an absolute sense was possible. Could it not be the case that after a certain point quantity would be transformed into quality? Was it not the case that once the principal means of production had been nationalized, and the last major capitalist expropriated, capitalism had necessarily been objectively abolished? And was this not the case for Russia following the October Revolution? To counter this contention that could all too easily be advanced by his Trotskyist critics, Cliff argued that the qualitative shift from capitalism to the transition to socialism could not be simply calculated from the, quote, percentage, end quote, of state ownership of the means of production. It was a transition that was necessarily politically determined. As we have seen, the tendency towards state capitalism was a result of the growing contradiction between the increasingly social forms of production and the private appropriation of wealth. Collective and ultimately state ownership of the means of production were a means to reconcile this contradiction while at the same time preserving private appropriation of wealth, and with the private appropriation of wealth, private property. Thus, the tendency towards state capitalism involved the partial negation of private property on the basis of private property itself. At the limit, state capitalism could be seen as the, quote, partial negation of capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself, end quote. So long as the state economy was run to exploit the working class in the interest of an exploitative class, then the economy remains state capitalist. However, if the working class seized power and ran the state economy in the interest of the workers as a whole, then state capitalism would give way to a workers' state and the transition to socialism could begin. Thus, state capitalism was a turning point. It was the final swan song of capitalism, but once the working class seized the state, it would be the basis for the transition to socialism. However, it could be objected that many revolutionary Marxists, including Trotsky himself, had explicitly denied that capitalism could reach the limit of state capitalism. Indeed, against the reformists in the Second International, who had argued that capitalism would naturally evolve into state capitalism, which could then be simply taken over by democratically capturing the state, revolutionary Marxists had argued that, while there was a tendency towards state capitalism, it can never be fully realized in practice due to the rivalries between capitalists and by the very threat of expropriation of the state by the working class. Cliff countered this by arguing that such arguments had only applied to the case of the evolution of traditional capitalism into state capitalism. In Russia, there had been a revolution that had expropriated the capitalist class and introduced a worker state, and then a counter-revolution which had restored capitalism in the form of state capitalism run in the interest of a new bureaucratic class. For Cliff, the Russian Revolution had created a worker state, but, isolated by the failure of socialist revolutionaries elsewhere in Europe, the worker state had degenerated. With the degeneration of the workers' state, the bureaucracy increasingly became separated from the working class until, with Stalin's ascendancy, it was able to constitute itself as a new exploitative class and seize state power. With the bureaucracy's seizure of power, the worker state was overturned and state capitalism was restored to Russia. The periodization of post-revolutionary era in Russia not only allowed Cliff to overcome the objection that Trotsky had denied the possibility of this periodization of post-revolutionary era in Russia not only allowed Cliff to overcome the objection that Trotsky had denied the possibility of bourgeois society fully realizing the tendency towards state capitalism, but also allowed him to accept most of Trotsky's analysis of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. Cliff only had to part ways with Trotsky for the analysis of the 10 years following 1928, where Trotsky maintained that the USSR had remained a degenerated workers' state, while Cliff argued that it had become state capitalist. Yet, as we shall see, this periodization, despite all its advantages for Cliff's credibility as a Trotskyist, was to prove an important weak point in his theory. But before looking at the weak points of Cliff's theory of state capitalism, we must first examine more closely what Cliff saw as the nature of state capitalism in Stalin's Russia. As we have seen, although Cliff uncritically defended the orthodox Marxist definition of capitalism, Cliff was able to counter the objections that the USSR could not be, in any sense, capitalist, because there was neither the law of value nor private property, by arguing that state capitalism was the, quote, partial negation of capitalism on the basis of capitalism itself, end quote. So what did he mean by the, quote, partial negation of capitalism, end quote? Clearly, capitalism could not be completely negated, otherwise, capitalism would not be capitalism. So in what sense is the negation of capitalism partial? With Cliff, the meaning of the partial negation of capitalism becomes most evident in terms of the law of value. Following Marx, Cliff argued that under capitalism there is a twofold division of labor. First of all, there is the division of labor that arises between capitalist enterprises, which is regulated by the law of value that operates through the, quote, anarchy of the market, end quote. Secondly, there is the division of labor that arises within each capitalist enterprise, which is directly determined by the rational and conscious dictates of the capitalists or their managers. Of course, the second division of labor is subordinated to the law of value, insofar as the capitalist enterprise has to compete on the market. However, the law of value appears as external to it. For Cliff, the USSR acted as if it was simply one huge capitalist class. For Cliff, the USSR acted as if it was simply one huge capitalist enterprise. As such, the law of value no longer operated within the USSR. It had been negated with the nationalization of production and the introduction of comprehensive state planning. But insofar as the USSR is obliged to compete both economically and politically within the capitalist world system, it became subordinated to the law of value like any capitalist enterprise. In this sense, for Cliff, the law of value was only, quote, partially negated on the basis of the law of value itself, end quote. Cliff. Yet if neither market nor the law of value operated within the USSR, this implied that products were not really bought and sold within the USSR as commodities. They were simply allocated and transferred in accordance with administrative prices. If this was true, then it also implied that labor power was not really a commodity, a conclusion that Cliff was forced to accept. Indeed, as Cliff argued, if labor power was to be a commodity, then the worker had to be free to sell labor power periodically to the highest bidder. If the worker could only sell his ability to work once and for all, then he was little different from a slave, since in effect he sold himself, not his labor power. Yet in the USSR, the worker could only sell his labor power to one employer, the state. Hence, the worker was not free to sell to the highest bidder, and labor power was not really a commodity. New section. The flaws in Cliff's theory of state capitalism. At first sight, Cliff provides a convincing theory of state capitalism in the USSR, which not only remains firmly within the broad orthodox Marxist tradition, but also preserves much of Trotsky's contribution to this tradition. As the post-war era unfolded, leaving the Stalinist bureaucracy more firmly entrenched than ever, Cliff's analysis of the USSR became increasingly attractive. Without the problem facing orthodox Trotskyist groupings following the apparent failure of Trotsky's prediction of the fall of the Stalinist bureaucracy, Cliff, under the slogan of, quote, neither Washington nor Moscow, end quote, was in a perfect position to attract supporters with the revival of interest in Leninism and Trotskyism of the revival of interest in Leninism and Trotskyism of the 1960s and 1970s. Indeed, with the International Socialist Group, which had then become the Socialist Workers' Party, Cliff has been able to build one of the largest Leninist groupings in Britain, whose most distinctive feature has been its refusal to take sides in the Cold War. That would not, I think it's pretty established at this point in time that the Socialist Workers' Party, despite now that the Soviet Union is gone, and even prior to then, has decided to take sides in the campus positions in the sphere of world politics. There's a very good book about called Indefensible: The Rhetoric of Anti-Imperialism, published by Haymarket Press by Rohini Hensman, which critiques the rise of dog shit basically what you might refer to as dog shit anti-imperialist politics within the radical left, or their maintenance, and the way that they've kind of penetrated into surprising areas, including the Socialist Workers' Party. The Socialist Workers' Party also sides with Islamism against the West broadly conceived, which leads it to do things like celebrate the pogrom of October 7th. So the third campism of international socialists in the United Kingdom, represented by the Socialist Workers' Party, is destroyed. If you look at the work of like Rohini Hensman, who's affiliated with the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in Great Britain, she talks about how there was like a decline, particularly in the 1980s, of the third campus politics in the Socialist Workers' Party, but how for a long time Cliff's party definitely represented a third campus position. I think one of the main things is that it's cited the Socialist Workers' Party. There was a war in the 1980s, and I'm not sure about the exact details of it, so I'm kind of talking out my ass. But in the 1980s, there was a war between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Iraq. And initially, the Socialist Workers' Party took a third campus position, right? On that issue, but then instead started to give critical support to Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, with all of its charming features, because, to my understanding, almost purely on the grounds that Iraq was closer with the United States. Which is, viewed as like the prime enemy or something like that. But that was just a side note for me. The International Socialist Tendency no longer refuses to take sides in the Cold War is over, but it no longer takes like a third campus position. It's important that the Socialist Workers' Party really did, to my understanding, I'm not an expert on this subject, but the Socialist Workers' Party did represent a massive improvement over Orthodox Trotskyism. It's especially when you don't come, I don't come from a Trotskyist background. I wasn't get into radical politics through the, everyone gets into radical politics usually through some kind of very particular milieu, and then kind of feel their way out to maybe make some changes in their political output. But I wasn't raised around Trotskyism, but just learn in my brief studies of Trotskyism over the past year, which are a bit part of my thesis and part of my interest in the Russian question. Obviously, Leon Trotsky is a huge figure in the Russian question, and the movement that bears his namesake. But there's so much diversity within that overall grouping of Trotskyists. And I would say historically the Socialist Workers' Party has represented a positive development within that overall milieu, but in recent years with its apologetics, if not embrace of Islamism, is a serious mark of decline. But that kind of seems like a more or less, aside from, with few exceptions, that kind of seems like a pretty common thing generally, and just from what I understand of radical left politics in the United Kingdom in general, is maybe not like straight up like tankyism, but definitely this kind of like more or less softly critical view of the opponents of the United States. Maybe that's an exaggeration, I don't know, but that's just my feeling. It seems like, for instance, like the anarchist milieu or like the radical libertarian left milieu is kind of like, in some sense, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I'm talking to my ass. I'll just stop. But it seems like there's like, you know, a degree to which just like the general just like anti-Americanism, like anti-Americanism is kind of like seeped into like their politics, causing them to take dubious political positions on questions of world politics. But maybe I'm wrong. That's just like a vibe I get. I don't really have evidence for that, or at least any evidence that I can call to hand. It's just like a vibe. Anyway, however, despite the attractiveness of Cliff's theory of state capitalism in the USSR, on close inspection we find Cliff's theory has vital weaknesses which have been seized on by more orthodox Trotskyists. Indeed, these weaknesses are so serious that many have concluded that Cliff's theory is totally flawed. This opinion has been recognized within the Socialist Workers' Party itself and has resulted in various attempts to reconstruct Cliff's original theory. As we shall argue, these flaws in Cliff's theory arise to a large extent from his determination to avoid critical confrontation with both Trotsky and the broader orthodox Marxist tradition. There are three main flaws within Cliff's theory of state capitalism in the USSR. The first concerns Cliff's insistence that the final ascendancy of Stalin, and with this the introduction of the first five-year plan, marked a counter-revolution which overthrew the worker state established by the October Revolution and turned Russia over to state capitalism. The issue of when the USSR became state capitalist is clearly a sensitive one for Trotskyists, since, if Cliff is unable to hold the line at 1928, then what is to stop the date of the defeat of the revolution being pushed right back to 1917? That is fucking important. The issue of when the USSR became state capitalist is clearly a sensitive one for the Trotskyists, since if Cliff is unable to hold the line at 1928, then what is to stop the date of the defeat of the revolution being pushed right back to 1917? Lenin and Trotsky would then be seen as leading a revolution that simply introduced state capitalism into Russia. Such fears were clearly expressed by Ted Grant in his response to Cliff's original presentation of his theory in the nature of Stalinist Russia. Then Ted Grant warned, quote, "If Comrade Cliff's thesis is correct that state capitalism exists in Russia today, then he cannot avoid the conclusion that state capitalism has been in existence since the Russian Revolution, and the function of the revolution itself was to introduce this state capitalist system of society. For despite his torturous efforts to draw a line between the economic basis of Russian society before the year 1928 and after, the economic basis of Russian society has in fact remained unchanged." End quote. Ted Grant, The Unbroken Thread. The first line of attack that has been taken by Orthodox Trotskyists has been to argue that if there had been a counter-revolution against rather than from within the revolution itself, which restored Russia to capitalism, then the worker state would have to have been violently smashed. Any attempt to argue for a gradual and peaceful restoration of capitalism would, as Trotsky himself had said, simply be, quote, running backwards the film of revisionism, end quote. Yet, despite the expulsions of Trotsky from the United and Left oppositions, I misread that. Yet, despite the expulsions of Trotsky and the United and Left oppositions in 1928, the leadership of the party and the state remained largely intact. Indeed, there seems more of a continuity within the state before 1928 and afterwards, rather than any sharp break that would indicate a counter-revolution, let alone any violent coup d'etat or violent counter-revolutionary action. Yeah, I'm just thinking to myself right now, because like one of the it seems like the destruction of capitalistic tendencies in the USSR was very much intensified in the Stalinist period, while concurrently the exploitative features of the USSR were also extended. There's a helicopter overhead. It's looking for me. I don't even know where my thought was there. Yeah, so like, I think like James Burnham like kind of points this out in his Marxist days. Is like, so like because there was a very much stronger introduction of planning and nationalization and state control during the 5-year plan. Does that mean, and that's the criteria that Trotsky puts forward for the USSR being a degenerated worker state, does that mean that Stalin made the USSR more of a worker state? And then you could say the thing is like the capitalistic tendencies within the USSR were most apparent during the new economic policy period. It's like I think that's why I think there's I don't know, like it's act as if the capitalistic features of the USSR were established in 1928 or like firmly established in that period seems highly dubious to me. I would be really cautious of saying that the USSR, there was definitely a democratic decline after 1928, and there was democratic decline way earlier than that as well within the USSR in terms of like workers' control of the state that was essentially ostensibly theirs. But if you're talking about how social how production is carried out, it seems really, really a stretch to say that the USSR became capitalist or something like that after 1928, and wasn't before. That just seems like, that doesn't hold up to the historical record. Now, you can say that exploitation increased, but exploitation is way broader. Is way broader of a concept, or way more of a not transhistorical, but way more historically generalizable than capitalism is, right? There's exploitation in all different types of societies that are not capitalism, merely because the USSR tried to grow and expand at the expense of the direct producer in the USSR is insufficient evidence that state capitalism, that the USSR was capitalist. That exploitation would have to take the specifics form of being mediated, however distorted, by value categories. Such as money and commodity, capital value, that kind of thing. Anyway, just talking to myself. Cliff attempted to counter this line of attack by arguing that while it is necessary for a proletarian revolution to smash the bourgeois state in order to construct a new revolutionary proletarian state, it is not necessarily the case that a counter-revolution has to smash an existing worker state. The example Cliff used was that of the army. In order to create a worker state, the bourgeois standing army has to be transformed into a workers' militia. But any such transformation inevitably would be resisted by the officer corps. Such resistance would have to be violently crushed. In contrast, the officers of a workers' militia may become increasingly independent to the point at which they become part of the bureaucracy, thereby transforming the workers' militia into a bourgeois standing army. Such a process in which a workers' militia becomes transformed into a standing army does not necessarily meet any concerted resistance, and as a consequence may occur gradually. Yet such an argument by itself fails to pin the counter-revolutionary brake on 1928. Indeed, Cliff's example would seem to imply that the counter-revolution was brought about by Trotsky himself, and Trotsky took charge of reorganizing the Red Army in 1918 on the lines of a conventional standing army. The only overt political indication Cliff is able to present for the bureaucratic counter-revolution is that the Moscow show trials and purges, which he claims were, quote, the civil war of the bureaucracy against the masses, a war in which only one side was armed and organized. They witnessed the consummation of the bureaucracy's total liberation from popular control, end quote. Sorry, I spaced out for a second. I got to reread that last bit. I spaced out, totally. Yet such an argument by itself fails to pin the counter-revolutionary brake on 1928. Indeed, Cliff's example would seem to imply that the counter-revolution was brought about by Trotsky himself when Trotsky took charge of reorganizing the Red Army in 1918 on the lines of a conventional standing army. The only overt political indication Cliff is able to present for the bureaucratic counter-revolution is the Moscow show trials and purges, which he claims were, quote, the civil war of the bureaucracy against the masses, a war in which only one side was armed and organized. They witnessed the consummation of the bureaucracy's total liberation from popular control, end quote. Cliff, State Capitalism in Russia. Yet the Moscow show trials occurred in 1930s, not in 1928. What was crucial about 1928 was that it was the year that marked the beginning of the first five-year plan and the bureaucracy's commitment to the rapid industrialization of Russia. For Cliff, by adopting the overriding imperative of industrializing Russia regardless of the human cost this would involve, the Soviet bureaucracy had taken on the historic role of the bourgeoisie. In adopting both the economy and historic functions of the bourgeoisie, the bureaucracy transformed itself into an exploitative class. Whereas before 1928, the bureaucracy had simply been a privileged layer within a degenerated workers' state that was able to gain more than its fair share of the nation's wealth. After 1928, the bureaucracy became the state capitalists who collectively exploited the working class. Of course, it was not difficult for Cliff to show that there had been a sharp decrease in the material conditions of the working class following the introduction of the first five-year plan, as the bureaucracy sought to make the proletariat pay the huge cost of the policy of rapid industrialization. However, Cliff's arguments that this sharp decrease in material conditions of the working class represented a qualitative shift towards the exploitation of the working class by the bureaucracy was far from convincing. If anything, Cliff's attempt to show a qualitative shift in the social relations of production only served to indicate that bureaucratic exploitation of the working class had existed before 1928. Yet perhaps more devastating to the credibility of Cliff's line of argument among Trotskyists was that by suggesting that with the imposition of the policy of rapid industrialization, the bureaucracy had finally transformed itself into an exploitative class, and in doing so transformed Russia from a degenerated workers' state into state capitalism, Cliff was in effect attacking Trotsky. Had it not been the main criticism advanced by Trotsky and the left opposition against Stalin that he had not industrialized soon enough? Had it not been the main criticism advanced by Trotsky and the left opposition against Stalin that he had not industrialized soon enough? Was not the central plank of Trotsky's understanding of the Russian Revolution that the productive forces had to be advanced as fast as possible if there was to be any hope of socialism? If this was so, was not Cliff accusing Trotsky of advocating state capitalism? Ultimately, Cliff is unable to circumvent Trotsky's intrinsic complicity with Stalin. As a consequence, the failure to break with Trotskyism led to this vital flaw in Cliff's theory of state capitalism in Russia. Yet this is not all. Cliff's failure to critically confront orthodox Marxism opened up another, even more important weakness in his theory of state capitalism, which has been seized upon by his more orthodox Trotskyist critics. This weakness stemmed from Cliff's denial of the operation of the law of value within the USSR. This stemmed from Cliff's denial of the operation of the law of value within the USSR. As we have seen, for Cliff, the USSR was constituted as if it was one huge capitalist enterprise. As such, there could be no operation of the law of value internal to the USSR. However, as Marx pointed out, it is only through the operation of the law of value that any capitalist enterprise is constrained to act as capital. If there was no law of value internal to the state economy of the USSR, what made it act as if it was a capitalist enterprise? The answer was the Soviet Union's relation to world capitalism. It was through the competitive political and economic relation to the rest of the capitalist world that the Soviet Union was subordinated to the law of value, and it was through this subordination to the law of value that the capitalist nature of the USSR became expressed. However, as Cliff recognized, the Soviet Union with its huge natural resources had become largely self-sufficient. Foreign trade with the rest of the world was minimal compared with the amount produced and consumed within Russia itself. As a result, Cliff could not argue that the international law of value imposed itself on the Russian economy through the necessity to compete on the world market. Instead, Cliff had to argue that the law of value imposed the law of value itself indirectly on the USSR through the necessity to compete politically with the major capitalist imperialist powers. In order to keep up with the arms race, particularly with the emergence of the Cold War with the USA, the USSR had to accumulate huge amounts of military hardware. This drive for military accumulation led the drive for accumulation elsewhere in the Russian economy. Indeed, this military competition could be seen to spur capital accumulation, and with it the exploitation of the working class, just as much, if not more so, than any economic competition from the world market could have done. And just as a side note, it's like, the Soviet economy growing, I don't think, or industrializing, is proof of its capitalist character either, right? Just because it builds upon itself, it exploits the direct producers in order to build upon itself, seems insufficient to characterize the USSR as capitalist. However, as Cliff's Trotskyist critics point out, for Marx the law of value does not impose the law of value itself through, quote, competition, end quote, as such, but through the competitive exchange of commodities. Indeed, it is only through the exchange of commodities that value is formed, and since it is only through such exchange that the law of value can come to impose itself. Military accumulation is not directly an accumulation of values, but an accumulation of use values. In a capitalist economy, such an accumulation can become part of the overall process of the accumulation of value, and hence of capital, insofar as it guarantees the accumulation of capital in the future by protecting or else extending foreign markets. However, in itself, military accumulation is simply an accumulation of things, not capital. That's what I was just saying. However, in itself, military accumulation is simply an accumulation of things, not capital. So in capitalist countries, military spending suppresses value and the law of value temporarily in order to extend it later. Given the Soviet Union did not seek to expand value production through the conquest of new markets, military production meant the permanent suppression of value and the law of value, in that it was simply the production of use values required to defend a system based on the production of use values. For the more sophisticated Trotskyists, Cliff's attempt to invoke military competition as the means through which the USSR was subordinated to the law of value exposed the fundamental theoretical weakness of Cliff's theory of state capitalism in Russia. The argument put forward by Cliff that under state capitalism, quote, the accumulation of value turns into its opposite, the accumulation of use values, end quote. is nothing but a sophistry which strips away the specific social forms that are essential to define a particular mode of production such as capitalism. I really, really, really like that sentence. The argument put forward by Cliff that under state capitalism, quote, the accumulation of value turns into its opposite, the accumulation of use values, end quote, is nothing but a sophistry which strips away the specific social forms that are essential to define a particular mode of production, such as capitalism. As they correctly point out, capital is not a thing but a social relation that gives rise to specific social forms. The fact that military hardware is accumulated is in no way the same thing as the accumulation of capital. Without the production of commodities, there can be no value, and without value, there can be no accumulation of capital. But Cliff argues there is no production of commodities in the USSR, particularly not in the military industry, since nothing is produced for a market, thus there can be neither value nor capital. The fact that military hardware is accumulated is no way the same thing as the accumulation of capital. Without the production of commodities, there can be no value, and without value, there can be no accumulation of capital. But Cliff argues there is no production of commodities in the USSR, particularly not in the military industries, since nothing is produced for a market, thus there can be neither value nor capital. This point can be further pressed home once Cliff's critics turn to the question of labor power. For Marx, the specific nature of any mode of production was determined by both the manner and forms through which the dominant class are able to extract surplus value from the direct producers. Within the capitalist mode of production, surplus value is extracted from the direct producers by the purchase of the workers' labor power as a commodity. As a consequence, surplus labor is expropriated in the form of surplus value, which is the difference between the value of labor power, i.e. the cost of reproducing the worker's ability to work, and the value the worker creates through working. However, for Cliff, labor power was not a commodity in the USSR and was not therefore really sold. But if labor power was not a commodity, it could not have a value. And hence any surplus labor extracted could not take the form of surplus value. If surplus labor did not take the form of surplus value, how could the USSR be in any sense capitalist in strict Marxist terms? The third fatal flaw in Cliff's theory of state capitalism in Russia, and one that arises from Cliff's commitment to orthodox Marxism, is the view that state capitalism is the highest stage of capitalism. As we have seen, it is essential for Cliff that state capitalism was the highest stage of capitalism, since it was from this premise that he could claim that state capitalism was at the point of transition from capitalism to socialism. But if state capitalism is the highest stage of capitalism, and if it is accepted that the USSR is state capitalist, then this would seem to imply that, in some fundamental sense, the USSR should be in advance of Western capitalism. Of course, this may have seemed reasonable in the late 1940s. After all, under Stalin, the USSR had made an unprecedented leap towards the rapid industrialization of Russia, and it seemed that the Soviet Union was set to outperform most of the capitalist countries in the West in the post-war era. However, in the following decades, the economic stagnation and economic waste of the, quote, Soviet system, end quote, became increasingly apparent, culminating with the collapse of the USSR in 1990. This combined with the globalization of capital, which has seriously undermined the efficacy of state intervention in Western capitalism, has meant that the notion that capitalism is tending towards state capitalism is now far less convincing than it was 50 years ago. As we shall see in the next issue, although Cliff did develop a theory to explain the economic stagnation of the Soviet Union, it proved insufficient to explain the final crisis and collapse of the USSR. The point has been taken up with relish by Cliff's more orthodox critics, who now feel vindicated that the Stalinist system had proved ephemeral, and as Trotsky predicted, capitalism had been restored, albeit after some delay. So despite its practical appeal during the post-war era, Cliff's theory of state capitalism in Russia was theoretically, at least for orthodox Trotskyists, fatally flawed. Indeed, for the more sophisticated Trotskyists, Cliff's theory is usually dismissed with little more ado, and then presented as an example of the weakness of all theories of state capitalism. But Cliff's theory of state capitalism in the USSR is by no means the original or foremost one, although it is perhaps the most well-known. In the next issue, we shall begin to consider other theories of state capitalism in the USSR that have arisen amongst the left. that have arisen among the left's communists before turning to examine Tikhtin's effort to go beyond the theory of Russia as a degenerated worker state and state capitalist theories. Yeah, this is a very important thing, right? And this is something that you could say, like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in the UK, because they kind of trace their like theoretical starting points to, or not starting points, but like their distinctive starting points from the minority within the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States that went on to become the Workers' Party under the leadership of Max Shachtman. And obviously the Workers' Party under Max Shachtman and, other people and with the contributions of other people associated with the Workers' Party, this becomes, that's where they get the thing, the Alliance for Workers' Liberty gets their theoretical, they draw on that tradition heavily. But that tradition has a bureaucratic collectivism thesis of the USSR. But I believe, I'd have to reread it, but I believe Martin Thomas in the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, who's an important figure in that, believes that the USSR was state capitalist. And he makes the point in one of his essays to hammer home the idea that the USSR, the state capitalist conception of the USSR is not reducible to its elaboration as put forward by Tony Cliff. And anyone who's operating within, who's not operating strictly within the Trotskyist milieu knows this to be the case. That's the end of this section of what was the USSR towards a theory of the deformation of value under state socialism. And now I'm going to read the notes. Note 1. For convenience, we shall at times use the term, quote, state capitalism for all theories that consider the Soviet Union to have been capitalist. As Neil Fernandez points out in a forthcoming book, Capitalism and Class Struggle in the USSR, many theories, for example, those of Bordiga and more recently Chattopadhyay, have for good theoretical reasons avoided the terms, quote, state capitalism in their accounts of the USSR. We will deal with some of the issues raised by the term, quote, state capitalism in more detail in Aufheben 8. Note 2. Quote, ultra-left is a loaded and ambiguous term. It was originally a term of abuse used by Lenin against communists and revolutionaries, particularly in Western European countries such as Holland, Germany, and Italy, who refused to accept the Bolshevik model of revolution and the right of the Russian Communist Party to determine the tactics and leadership of the world communist movement. These communists were among the first to put forward the idea that Russia was a form of state capitalism. We shall examine such theories in the next issue. On the term itself, it should be noted that most people accused of ultra-leftism by Leninists would argue that they are simply communists and that the left, including their accusers, are not. The matter is further confused by the tendency of Leninists to denounce each other for, quote, ultra-leftism for such heinous crimes as not voting labor. Perhaps more importantly for us, the term, quote, ultra-leftism indicates an acceptance, along with Trotskyism, of the idea of tracing one's tradition back to the social democracy of the Second and Third Internationals. While we will happily restate our position that the German, Dutch, and Italian left communists did maintain some important lessons from the revolutionary wave following the First World War, we do not think they had the last word on what revolutionary theory and practice is for us today. This will become clearer once we come to examine their theories of the Soviet Union. Note 3. Of course, prisoner support work is an important part of any serious movement against the state, and in particular circumstances, of the anti-poll tax movement, when Militant, the journal, or the group, threatened to grasp people to the police, it did define as radical engagement. And in the particular circumstances of the anti-poll tax movement, when Militant threatened to grasp people to the police, it did define a radical engagement in the struggle. But there's nothing inherent in leftism that leads it to ignore prisoners. Simply criticizing the, quote, left
for not supporting prisoners ends up as little better than ritual denunciation of the left for being, quote, boring middle-class wankers, end quote. A poor excuse for a proper critique. Yet it is perhaps little surprise that prisoner support has become an almost definitive position amongst many anarchists now that denouncing the left for supporting the USSR is no longer viable.
Four, there's little doubt that it was fear that the whole of Western Europe might go over to the Eastern Bloc in the years following the Second World War, which prompted the American bourgeoisie to pour billions of dollars into shattered Western European economies in the form of Marshall Aid. 5. It should be remembered that the reformist parties of the Second International not only betrayed their commitment to opposing the First World War and as such were complicit in the decimation of a whole generation of the European working class, but they also played an important role in crushing the revolutions that swept much of Europe following the war. For example, it was under the orders of a social democratic government that the Russian Revolution was crushed and such revolutionary leaders as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht killed. Such crimes could not be that easily forgotten. Note 6. Of course, at this point, some may object that Trotsky's record proves that he was a counter-revolutionary and as a consequence dismiss any detailed consideration of Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state. For us, an extensive consideration of Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state is important not only because this theory has become a central reference point for criticisms of the Soviet Union, but also because it is important to show how Trotsky's theory emerged directly from the objectivism of orthodox Marxism that was in no way a betrayal of such traditions. It might not have been a betrayal, but there was diversity of views within Orthodox Marxism about the USSR. Within Orthodox Marxism about the USSR. Take, for instance, Karl Kautsky or Julius Martov, who weren't within the Leninist camp. Anyway. For us, an extensive consideration of Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state is important, not only because this theory has become a central reference point for criticisms of the Soviet Union, but also because it is important to show how Trotsky's theory emerged directly from the objectivism of orthodox Marxism and was in no way a betrayal of such traditions. Hence, our focus will remain on the political economy that developed in the USSR, rather than offering a blow-by-blow account of the revolution/counter-revolution. For details of the 1917 to 21 period that undermine the Leninist account of the Russian Revolution, see Marty Sprinton, The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, which is on this channel. For a more general critique of orthodox Marxism of both Second and Third International, see Guy Debord, The Society of the Spectacle, Chapter 4. Note 7. In what follows, some readers may think we are treating Trotsky's theory with too much respect, for it is enough to list his bad deeds. Some focus on his actions in 1917 to 21, others more on Trotsky's later failure to maintain revolutionary positions, which culminated with his followers taking sides in the Second World War. From this, it is often concluded that Trotsky's Marxism was always counter-revolutionary, as many left communists argue that at some point Trotsky crossed the class line and became counter-revolutionary. Either way, Trotsky's theory of a degenerated worker state can be summarily dismissed as a position outside the revolutionary camp. For us, however, Trotsky's theory of the USSR and its dominant hold over many critical of Stalinism reflect fundamental weaknesses of orthodox Marxism that should be grasped and overcome. There are very powerful reasons why heterodox Marxists have found it hard to grasp the USSR as capitalist. In rejecting Trotsky's theory of the USSR as a degenerated worker state, it is not for us a matter of showing how he, quote, betrays the true revolutionary heritage of pre-1914 social democracy and orthodox Marxism, end quote. I don't know whose quote that is, but rather it involves recognizing how true he was to this tradition. 8. Trotsky originally developed the theory of permanent revolution in collaboration with Parvis. After Parvis withdrew from Marxist politics, the theory eventually became ascribed to Trotsky. 9. Trotsky is himself not very clear at this point as to why the very backwardness of peasantry would lead a substantial part of this class to maintain its support for a workers' government. committed to introducing socialist policies. However, this apparently paradoxical position can be resolved if we consider a little more closely Trotsky's view of the peasantry. For Trotsky, the backwardness of heterogeneity of the peasantry meant that it was inherently incapable of developing a coherent organization that could formulate and advance its own distinct class interest. As a consequence, the peasantry could only accept the leadership of other classes, i.e., either the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. From this, Trotsky could conclude that once the peasantry had accepted the leadership of the proletariat, it would have little option but to be swept along by the policies of a workers' government, even beyond the point where such policies began to impinge on peasants' own immediate class interests, since they would be unable to formulate any viable alternative. Note 10. The Revolution betrayed by Leon Trotsky. Note 11. We shall give more attention to the ideas Lenin's left communist opponents in Aufheben 8. 12. Following Engels, it was generally accepted within orthodox Marxism that there could be no leap from capitalism to a fully fledged communist society in which the state money and wage labor had been abolished. It was envisaged that any post-capitalist society would have to pass through a lower stage of communism, during which the state money and wage labor would gradually wither away as the conditions for the higher stage of communism came into being. This lower stage of communism became known as socialism. 13. For example, in his Leon Trotsky's Theory of Revolution, John Molyneux says, quote, "Suffice it to say that in the early years of the revolution, Trotsky stood on the authoritarian wing of the party," end quote. Of course, as Kowalski has pointed out, the division of left-right, libertarian/authoritarian may oversimplify the complex of political positions taken up among the Bolsheviks during this period. However, it is quite clear that Trotsky was neither on the left nor the libertarian wings of the party at this time. 14. As both Engels and Kautsky had pointed out in relation to Germany, the fundamental barrier to the development of industrial capitalism was the low productivity of traditional forms of small-scale peasant agriculture. If the urban populations necessary for industrialization were to be fed, then the peasants had to produce an agricultural surplus over and above their own immediate needs. So long as traditional forms of agriculture persist, the total amount of agriculture produce is limited. Thus, the only way to produce the surplus necessary for industrialization is to depress the living standards of the peasantry through such means as high rents and taxation. Yet the scope for squeezing the peasants' already impoverished living standards is limited. Sooner or later, there has to be an agricultural revolution which, by concentrating production in large-scale farms, allows the introduction of modern mechanized production methods. Under capitalism, this occurred either through the landlord or the richer peasants appropriating land and transforming themselves into capitalist farmers. The socialist alternative was to collectivize agriculture. By grouping peasants together in large-scale production would be made possible without dispossessing vast numbers of poor peasants. In Russia, this agrarian problem was particularly acute. Before the revolution, the peasants had been forced to produce for the market in order to pay rents and taxes to the landlords and states. I think there's there's evidence to counter that claim. Peasants generally are not market dependent. Generally speaking. So obviously the peasants did have to pay, were exploited and did have to pay like taxes, for instance. But I believe those taxes were in kind, paid directly to the state. I'm not sure about that. I think there's stuff about that in John Eric Merritt's piece that I talk about all the time, but should reread for the purposes of this channel, so I can listen to it again and again, because it seems like it says very important things. Also, it's also referenced in some of Lauren Goldner's work on the Soviet Union. Before the revolution, the peasants had been forced to produce for the market in order to pay rents and taxes to the landlords and the state. This surplus had then been used both to feed the urban populations and for export to earn the foreign currency needed to pay for the import of foreign capital required for industrialization. However, with the Stolypin reforms of 1906, the Tsarist regime had made a decisive effort to encourage the development of capitalist agriculture among the richer peasants. But this, quote, wager on the strong, end quote, peasant was canceled by the revolution. That's another. This is another thought. Is that the historical record proves that there is despite what Lenin claims, and the Bolsheviks claim, the level of stratification and differentiation, class differentiation within the countryside amongst the peasantry, not between peasantry and like traditional landlords, but amongst the peasantry themselves, was very limited. The idea that there was this kind of like these rich kulaks who employed a rural proletariat in pre-Soviet and pre-17 and post-1917 Soviet Union is very dubious. Anyway, this surplus had then been used to both feed the urban populations and for export to earn the foreign currency needed to pay for the import of foreign capital required for industrialization. However, with the Stolypin reforms of 1906, the Tsarist regime had made a decisive effort to encourage the development of capitalist agriculture among the richer peasants. But this, quote, wager on the strong, end quote, peasant was canceled by the revolution. The expropriation of the landlords and the redistribution served to reinforce small-scale subsistence agriculture, with neither the compulsion nor any incentives to produce a surplus on the part of the peasant. Food supplies in the urban areas fell. It had been this that compelled the Bolshevik government to introduce direct requisitioning under war communism. While the NEP, the Bolshevik government now sought to provide incentives for the richer peasants to produce for the market. Collectivization was ruled out since for it to succeed on a large scale, collectivization required a sufficient level of industrialization to allow the mechanization of agriculture. To this extent, the NEP represented in part a retreat to the Tsarist policy of encouraging the growth of capitalist agriculture amongst the rich peasants. We shall examine further this crucial agrarian question in more detail in the next issue. Note 15. Trotsky coined the phrase scissors crisis in his speech to the 12th Party Congress in April 1923. Trotsky argued that, left to the market, the uneven development between agriculture and industry could only lead to violent fluctuations between the prices of industrial goods and agricultural prices, and which could only undermine the NEP. Although agricultural production recovered rapidly after the introduction of the NEP, industrial production lagged behind. As a result, the price of industrial goods had risen far faster than agricultural prices, quote, opening the price scissors, end quote, and threatening to undermine the incentives for the peasants to produce for the market in the following season. By October, the predicted crisis struck home with the sales of grain plummeting. Following this quote scissors crisis, measures were introduced to control industrial prices. Note 16. While Stalin had established his power base as head of the organization of the party throughout the USSR, Zinoviev had built his power base at the head of the party in Leningrad, and Kamenev is his power base at the head of the Moscow party. 17. During the industrialization debate in the mid-1920s, Trotsky, along with the rest of the left opposition, repeatedly attacked by Stalin and his followers for being a, quote, super-industrializer, end quote, who wished to abandon the NEP and industrialize at the expense of the peasantry. This has been a common accusation made against Trotsky by Stalinists ever since, but has also been a criticism taken up by anarchists and others to the left of Trotsky, who argue that in adopting the policy of enforced industrialization and forced collectivization after 1928, Stalin was simply implementing Trotsky's own ideas. In this way, the essential complicity between Stalin and Trotsky can be demonstrated. In his article, The Myth of the Super-Industrializer, which was originally published under a different title in Critique 13, and now reprinted in The Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Michael Cox and Hillel Tickton, Richard Day, an important important commentator on the Soviet industrial dispute. He has a book called Leon Trotsky and the Politics of Economic Isolation. Anyway, Richard Day has sought to defend Trotsky from such accusations by distancing Trotsky from the more polemical positions of Preobrazhensky and stressing Trotsky's support for the Workers' and Peasants' Alliance embodied in the NEP. But this does not prove much. None of the main protagonists
in the industrialization debate, not even Preobrazhensky, argued for the abandonment of the NEP and the Workers' and Peasants' Alliance. The Workers' and Peasants' Alliance is also called the Smichka. The main vehicle, according to John Eric Merritt, the main vehicle for preserving the Smichka, the Workers' Peasants' Alliance, would have been the extension of the NEP into the indefinite future, loosening of. I think he argues that for loosening of party controls, that would allow more democracy into the political body of the Soviet Union. I think he has that was what would have preserved the Smichka. Forced collectivization was an absolute destruction of the Smichka, and so that's why it's kind of like troubling when you see like hammer and sickles, as if that concept substantially meant anything. The Worker Peasant Alliance substantially meant anything after forced collectivization. Is kind of has a very dark theory. It has a kind of a darker history that I don't think is recognized. Anyway, what is telling is Trotsky's own criticisms of Stalin's eventual policy of forced collectivization and industrialization. In the Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky does not criticize Stalin's industrial policy as such. Indeed, he is careful to praise the great achievements made by Stalin under this policy, but rather the, quote, zigzags, end quote, made in bringing this policy about. For Trotsky, the problem was that Stalin's reluctance to adopt the policy of industrialization put forward by the left opposition in the mid-1920s meant a sharper, quote, turn to the left, end quote, and a more rushed and unbalanced industrialization later in order to solve the crisis of 1928. But the crucial question is, if Stalin had shifted the burden of industrialization onto the peasantry a few years earlier, would this have really been sufficient to have averted the grain procurement crisis in 1928 and avoided the disaster of forced collectivization in which millions of peasants died? New note. For a critique of orthodox Marxist interpretations of Marxist theory of commodity fetishism, see The Myth of Working Class Passivity by David Gorman in Radical Chains 2. Note 19. It should be noted that what is to be done was a particularly extreme formulation of democratic centralism that emerged out of a polemic against those Marxists who had argued that the class consciousness of the working class would necessarily develop out of economic struggles during a period of retreat in the class struggle. However, Lenin's position concerning democratic centralism can be seen to have undergone sharp shifts in emphasis depending on the political circumstances. At various points between 1917, Lenin's position would have been little different from that of Trotsky. Note 20. As well as Bolshevik left communists, many anarchists were also taken by the, quote, libertarian flavor, end quote, of the conception of post-revolutionary power outlined in Lenin's State and Revolution. This led to accusations that Lenin's actions after seizing power were a betrayal of the ideas he himself set out in State and Revolution, and is then suggested that Lenin had never really believed in them. But while it is undoubtedly true that Lenin did abandon some of the measures he called for in State and Revolution, that text was itself ambiguous, calling for a, quote, socialist revolution with subordination, control, foremen, and accountants, end quote. Never mind. I was going to say something, but never mind. Note 21. For example, see, can the Bolsheviks retain state power in Lenin's collected works? Note 22. The methods of, quote, scientific management advocated by Lenin were based on those developed by the most advanced capitalist enterprise in the West and which had become known as Taylorism. Taylorism had been specifically developed to break the control of the skilled worker over the immediate production process. Under Taylorism, the production process was reorganized and rationalized in a way which removed the initiative of the individual worker and concentrated the overall knowledge and control of how things were produced into the hands of specialized managers. Lenin's enthusiasm for Taylorism, an enthusiasm shared by Trotsky, is perhaps one of the areas where Lenin most clearly distinguishes his position from a communist one. It should be recognized, note 23, it should be recognized that most of these armies were not seriously
did not seriously fight the Bolsheviks. The Civil War is a war between organized armies, was a battle between the Red Army and the Whites, who had material support from the West, but as well as this, vast numbers of peasants and deserters fought both sides. Indeed, one could say that the 1918 to 21 period was as much a peasant war as anything else. Note 24. The introduction of one-man management and scientific management, together with the consequent transfer of power away from the factory committees to, first the trade unions and then to the party, is well documented in The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control by Maurice Brinton, again on this channel. As Brinton shows, this process began at a very early stage in the revolution, well before the start of the Civil War in the summer of 1918. Given the task of organizing the military defense of the revolution, Trotsky spent little time in abandoning the Red Guard militias that had been formed immediately after the October Revolution in favor of building a conventional standing army. At first, Trotsky sought to recruit from volunteers among the more advanced sections of the working class, in accordance with the procedures established within the Red Guards, allowed officers to be elected directly from soldiers' committees and assemblies. However, once he had established a reliable corps for the new Red Army, Trotsky introduced conscription, drawing recruits from the broad masses of peasants and workers with what he considered as less reliable troops. Trotsky abandoned the direct election of officers in favor of the appointment of professional commanders, which were mostly drawn from the former Tsarist army. To see and check any counter-revolutionary tendencies amongst this officer corps, Trotsky appointed political officers or commissars drawn from the party, each of whom were attached to a particular military commander. I have to use the restroom. And I don't think you guys want to hear me record while I'm in the restroom, do you? Okay. Note 26. As Kneipp has pointed out, the idea that the emergence of the bureaucracy represented a Russian thermidor had been first advanced by the democratic centralist opposition in the early 1920s. At that time, when he still led a position within the party, Trotsky had firmly rejected the idea of a Russian thermidor as being, quote, ultra-leftist. However, by 1929, facing disgrace and exile, Trotsky began to come around to the idea that it was only by the mid-1930s that came to fully formulate it with his criticisms of Stalinism. See Baruch Kneipp's Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. I have multiple chapters of that book on my channel. I hope to finish it soon. Note 27. Trotsky's, quote, orthodox Marxist, end quote, and objectivist idea of history as fundamentally about the progressive development of the productive forces is perhaps the key to understanding the underlying weakness of Trotsky's theory of the degenerated worker state. For Trotsky's lyrical accounts of how Stalinist Russia developed the forces of production, we need go no further than the opening pages of The Revolution Betrayed. On page 8 of this work, Trotsky declares, quote, with the bourgeois economists, we no longer have anything to quarrel over. Socialism has demonstrated socialism's right to victory, not in the pages of Das Kapital, but in an industrial arena comprising a sixth of the Earth's surface, not in the language of dialectics, but in the language of steel, cement, and electricity, end quote. Trotsky. Note 28. With the publication of Marx's early writings, particularly the economic and philosophical manuscripts, it is clear that for Marx the basis of capitalism is not private property but alienated labor. This point, as we shall see, is vital not only in making a critique of orthodox Marxism, but in any attempt to develop a materialist theory of the USSR. Note 29. Of course, at a more concrete level, it is clear that not all of the capitalist class directly exploit the working class. Bankers and merchant capitalists, for example, draw a share of the surplus value produced by the industrial capitalists by virtue of their special function in financing production and by circulating the commodities subsequently produced. Yet these functions can themselves be seen to be rooted in private property. The bank advances money to finance production as a loan to its own private property, and duly obtains a share in the surplus value in the form of interest. Likewise, by buying the commodities produced by the industrial capitalist, the merchant capitalists advance their own money capital to realize the value produced by the industrial capitalist ahead of the commodity's actual circulation. In doing so, the merchant capitalist appropriates a slice of the surplus value expropriated by the industrial capitalist in the form of the difference between the way they pay the industrial capitalist and what they sell the commodities for to the consumers. Note 30. See the new Constitution of the USSR. Note 31. As we've already noted, the notion that the concentration and centralization of capital inevitably led towards the fusion of state and capital had been central to the orthodox Marxism of the Second International. It had followed from this that the decisive shift from capitalism to socialism occurred with the working class seizing state power. The main question that then divided orthodox Marxism was whether the seizure of power required a revolution or whether this seizure of state power could be achieved through peaceful democratic means. In what is to be done, Lenin came to define his own position regarding the primacy of the political. Against the, quote, economism, end quote, of those who saw a socialist revolution arising directly out of the economic struggles of the working class, Lenin had argued for the importance of establishing a political party which could seize state power. Of course, it was the basis of this, quote, politicism, end quote, by implying that the realm of the political can to some extent determine the nature of society, has allowed Leninists to argue that the USSR is a worker state while at the same time admitting that the social relations of production may have remained capitalist. As we shall see in the next issue, it was the inability of most left communists to fully break from this, quote, politicism, end quote, that undermines their critique of the Bolsheviks. Section 32. It was this very transitional character of the Soviet bureaucracy which meant that it was difficult to define what it was. So although Trotsky settled on calling it a, quote, caste, end quote, Trotsky accepted this was an unsatisfactory organization of the Soviet bureaucracy. 33. One of the first groups to develop a proper theory was the state capitalist minority within the Workers' Party. The minority later emerged as the Johnson-Forrest tendency after the pseudonyms of its main theorists, C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya. With the collection of previously unavailable writings, we can now see that this theory is much stronger than it appears from some of their earlier published works, and it is far superior to Cliff's version. See the Marxist-Humanist Theory of State Capitalism by Raya Dunayevskaya, published with News and Letters in 1992. I have some pieces by Raya Dunayevskaya on this channel. Since the Johnson-Forrest tendency quickly broke from Trotskyism by rejecting vanguardism and emphasizing workers' autonomy, we shall deal with them in more detail in the next issue. 34. See C. Hobson and R. Tabor, Trotskyism and the Dilemma of Socialism, published with Greenwood in 1988. Note 35. The Revolutionary Communist Party subsequently broke up and should not be confused with the Revolutionary Communist Party that is around today. 36. Though this has not stopped the Socialist Workers' Party giving, quote, critical support, end quote, to some nationalist and Stalinist movements in, quote, non-imperialist, end quote, parts of the world. That's what I was referring to earlier. And this has only gotten worse since this book was published in the 90s. Where am I? Where the hell am I? Note 37. For a critique of Cliff's theory of state capitalism from a Trotskyist point of view, see the collection of articles on the nature of the USSR in Open Polemic 4 and 5. 38. That is the reformism that had been put forward by Bernstein and his followers in the debates in the Second International, that there could be a peaceful transition to socialism through democratically won reforms. 39. Cliff was able to cite Trotsky's reaction to Stalin's constitution, where he argued that it was the basis for the restoration of capitalism in the USSR as support for the possibility of peaceful counter-revolution. Note 40. While most Trotskyists in the 1940s clung on to the belief that the immediate post-war economic boom would be short-lived, and as a consequence repeatedly predicted an imminent return to economic slump, Cliff was one of the first to seek to explain the persistence of the post-war economic boom. Central to this explanation was Cliff's theory of a, quote, permanent arms economy, end quote, in which high levels of military spending acted to defer the full effects of the overaccumulation of capital, which had led to the great slump of the 1930s. The notion that the permanent arms economy was mirrored in the Soviet Union fitted neatly into Cliff's overall emphasis on the importance of military accumulation for modern capitalism. Okay, so that is the end of, we've reached the end of the notes, but that's the end of section 2 of Aufheben's What Was the USSR? Towards a Theory of the Deformation of Value Under State Capitalism. The next section is titled Russia as a Non-Mode of Production, which I assume will discuss the work of Hillel Ticktin. Thank you so much for listening.